All right, we're going to go over the second example about forms. I think we looked at it very briefly last week. And if we have time, we'll start tables. If not, review the tables example in the module for this week. And anyhow, let's look at forms. All right. This is a bigger form, and you notice it has multiple things on it, and it has things of different formats. And we'll go over all those, and we'll discuss their respective advantages and disadvantages. But let's introduce you to them right off the bat. Number one is a text box, which we went over last time. It's simply a place for you to enter any kind of text that you want to. Secondly, we have a drop-down. A drop-down list shows, you click on the little arrow, it shows a list of options that allows you to pick. Password control, and that doesn't echo your character back to the screen, just in case someone would be next to you or looking over your shoulder or whatever. It doesn't show that. These things are the things that are circular. Let's make it bigger so maybe you can see better. The things that are circular are what are called radio buttons. And radio buttons are typically grouped together. And the way radio buttons work is that if you click one in the group, it unclicks all of the other ones in the group. So if I say, I like rock, if I change it to hip hop, rock gets unclicked. So as you click, only one of the items of that list can have a choice, can be the chosen one. This would also be an example of a radio button. Finally, we have a checkbox, and think of a checkbox as being a yes or no question. Do I want to be on the mailing list? If I check it, it means yes. If I uncheck it, it means no. Likewise, read the terms. Yes, no. Finally, we have what is called a text area. Excuse me. A text area is multiple lines of place. So I can put longer comments in this compared to a text box. So I can put more stuff in there compared to a text box, which is just a single line of text. All right, so when would you use each of these? Well, you use a checkbox if it's a yes or no question. You could use a checkbox. You could also use two other things if it's a yes or no. You could make a drop down that had two options, yes and no, or you could make radio buttons where there's two options, yes or no. Now, you will never have a radio button that only has one option. A number of students do that every semester. They make a radio button for something that should be yes or no, and they only give a yes radio button. Well, if you have a yes radio button, if you click it, since there's nothing else to click, you can't unclick it. So if you said yes the first time, you're stuck with yes, and that's not good. So for a radio button, you would have at least two options, and you could make an option for yes and no by having two radio buttons. And you could have a drop down. Nice thing about drop down is you can put sort of this non-choice at the top that says, please make a choice, yes or no. And that way it won't default to it one way or another. All right. So what's the difference between those? If you can do those things several different ways, how would you choose? Well, one thing that we'll choose, one thing that you notice with the drop down, is that it takes up less space on the screen. You only see the options if you want to see the options by clicking on it. So if you imagine I had, let's say, a dozen choices here, then yes, I could use a radio button for them, but radio buttons would take up a lot of space on the screen. So if you have a lot of options, typically you use a drop down. If you have few options and you want the user to see all of them at once, you would choose a radio button then. Because notice with this, I don't have to do anything special to see all the options. All the options are displayed on the screen right off. And finally, a checkbox would be used if it's a yes or no question. Comments are in the text area, which is for multiple lines. Password, if you want to conceal it after you typed it in, and text boxes are the regular text boxes. So let's look and see how that code works on this page. Let's review a few things about forms. I want to do two things with this example. I want to show you how all these form controls work, and I want to give you some tips about styling forms to make them look good. So, first of all, form has an action and a method. The action is the name of the script that we are going to call when we submit the form. So way down here, there is a submit button. There's actually two submit buttons. And when you click one of the submit buttons, this is what script is going to get called. This is the name of the server-side script that's going to get called. The method is post, which means that the items that are sent are not part of the URL. They're not part of the query string. They get sent in another way. So let's enter in some stuff here. I'll just enter in a few things. I click submit. It goes to this page. And notice I don't see at the end of the URL my values. If the method was get, I would see those values on the query string. Notice how we see name equals Mike, email equals nothing, age equals 2, password equals nothing, RB music equals country, and so on down the line. So you choose, that's what get data does. It sends it where you can see it as part of the URL. Which way should you use? At this point, we're not going to worry about it too much. If it's anything secretive that you're sending, like a password, you probably would use post, because that way you can't see the values on the URL. Otherwise, if you had other ways of getting to that page, like links, then maybe you would make it get, because you could put query string values in URLs for a link or something. All right. In any case, that's what these are. And these have to be right for the form to be processed. For your example, I don't care. I don't know if I said to use get or post. If I did say one of the ways to use, then use that way. Otherwise, use either of the ways. Now, we're going to ignore the styling for a little bit. All right. So we're going to focus on these input tags for right now. This is a text box. And it has a name and an ID that's identical. All right. why does it need a name and an ID? It needs a name and ID because those are used for different purposes. The name is what it's going to be called when we send the data to the server. So if you remember in our Google query, the name of our text field was Q. Why did we choose Q? Because I knew that was the value, that was the name of the value that Google expected for a search. So I had to match what Google's expectations were. In this case, I'm sort of doing this myself, so I get to make up the name. A lot of times you will be writing both the client and the server code that processes this. So you'll be writing the script that processes the form. So just make sure the names match up with what you use in the server-side code. An ID is used for JavaScript, which we're not going to get into right now. But that's one place that you can easily use an ID. Text email, same thing. All right. Select, I have a name equals DD age, ID equals DD age. So I've given a name and ID of this dropdown. A dropdown is a select tag, beginning select tag, end select tag, that has inside it a list of options. So each of these options represents one of the values in the dropdown. Now, an option has two parts. It has the text that the user is going to see, and it has the value that the script is going to see. The value that the script's going to be is in the value attribute of the option. The value that the user is going to see is between the start option tag and the end option tag. Typically, the way it works is like this. We're writing this to go to a script that's going to process this. The script on the other end is expecting the data in a certain format. Or maybe we're saving this data to the database, to a database, and the database is expecting a certain format. In either case, we might have code such that 1, 2, 3, and 4 are how we store the date ranges in the database, or how we use them within the script. But if we just made the option 1, 2, 3, or 4, user doesn't know what we mean by 1, 2, 3, or 4, right? The user would only be able to understand if we give him something that is understandable. So 0 to 18 is one range, 19 to 35, 33 through 60, 61 plus. So we put between here a value that should be understandable to a person that's seeing this page. For the value of the option, we put in what the machine is expecting, what the machine would be able to understand. Let me give you another example. Let's say we had a drop down for faculty here. All right. Had a list of all the faculty names. Now, what we would put within the option would be the faculty name, of course, because you're going to recognize faculty people by their name. What we would put with the value would be their employee number, because the computer needs the employee number to process things. All right. And likewise, if we did it for students, would put between the option tag, would put your name, last name, first name, or whatever. For the value, we would use your student ID number, because everything in a system is keyed by your student ID number. So that's the reason for these options. Now, in your assignment, I've given particular values for these. Let's take a look at the assignment. All right. Name, what's that going to be? Probably a text box, right? Same thing with user ID. Form size, we're going to have an option. S for small, M for medium, L for large. Well, this is probably what we're going to put between the start and end option tag, because that's what we want the user to see, S, M, and L, small, medium, and large. Let me, I said that wrong. We're going to put the word in the option tag, small, because that's what the user will understand better, small, medium, or large. The value for the option is going to be S, M, and L, because the assumption here is our computer system on the other end doesn't need the full word small, it needs an S to know what is a small pizza. Likewise with crust. That might be an even better example, 1, 2, and 3. Who knows what 1, 2, or 3 means if I showed that to a user? You'd have to work at the pizza place to understand that 1 means thin, 2 means thick, and 3 means stuffed. So therefore, the value, or the stuff we're going to put in the option tag inside the start and end option tag is going to be thin, thick, and stuffed, because that's what the user is going to see. The value is what's going to be used behind the scenes, and that's going to be a 1, 2, or 3. So this will be probably a drop down. Could be a radio button though. This could be a drop down or radio button. These could either be check boxes, radio buttons, or drop downs. Now, if you did radio buttons or drop downs, you'd have to have 2 values, one for yes and one for no. All right. We use these other things when there's limits on what the user can enter, right? There's no limits on what the user can enter for name, right? Other than they probably have to enter something in, right? So we can't put any limitations really on the name field. However, for size, type of crust, and so on, there's only a certain number of values that you can enter, or that you should be allowed to enter. And that's where we use these drop downs and radio buttons, because you can't then type anything you want to for size. If you use a text box, the user will be able to type in whatever they wanted to for size. All right, and that might not be a size that our pizza place sells, right? So therefore, we have a drop down, and they're only allowed to choose one of these 3 things. Likewise, if this was a survey, let's say, and what's your favorite style of music between these 3, all right? We wouldn't want the user to be able to type stuff in, because they might spell things wrong. They might enter in an entry of stuff that we're not going to track, in our database or whatever. So therefore, we limit it to the number of allowable selections for the options. So here's our drop down. We give it a name, we give it an ID, and we create options. Now with a drop down, often you put sort of a dummy option at the very top that represents if no option is chosen. Because really in a drop down, there's always an option chosen. If you don't specify otherwise, the top option is always chosen. All right. So if I didn't have this here, look what it does. It defaults to 0 to 18. And if you're not careful, a person is liable to just go through this form and neglect to change their age range to the proper age range. And you'd get a lot of people that accidentally put themselves in the 0 through 18 year range. But if we put that other option in, then the first option that's selected is a dummy option, and we can write JavaScript code to make sure that they pick one of these other options. So that's how we do a drop down. A select with options. This is what the user is going to see and should be understandable for a user. This is going to be the value that gets sent to the server-side script, so the value that the system needs. A password field is pretty similar to a text box, except instead of saying type equals text, we say type equals password. Again, we're ignoring these other tags, and we'll come back to them in a few minutes. Input type equals radio is for a radio button. Now, to make it really work like a radio button, they all have to have the same name. So these all have the name RB Music. These all have the name RB Sport. If I spelled music wrong on one of them, then it wouldn't work like a radio button. I'll be able to check two. Why? Because these two are a group and this is a group by itself. And I would not be able to check that off because you can't unselect a radio button if there's only one item in the group. You got to make sure they all have the same name. They all need to have different IDs, but they'll all have the same name. And that's what ties the radio buttons together. The value that we put on a radio button is the value that the server is going to get if I've checked that radio button option. So, I forgot to save it. Now it's back to acting like a radio button. Now when I submit it, I send whatever the value of the selected item is. That might not be too obvious here because it's called rock and the selection is rock, but like this could be R. C. H. That value is what's going to get sent to the server. Notice that they get an H sent to the server. Checkbox. Instead of having radio for the type, we have checkbox for type. And checkboxes are always standalone. You can't group checkboxes together. We also have a value for checkbox. That's the value that gets sent if the checkbox is checked. So if I check both of these and submit, then the value that gets sent for both of them is yes. Now I can default things, and companies often do default things in a way that makes sense for them. All right. So for example, here, do you want to be on the mailing list? By default, this is going to be checked. So when that page initially loads, mailing list is already checked. Why do they do that? Well, because if you're lazy and don't uncheck it, you're on their mailing list, and that's really what they want. They want you to sign up for their mailing list. Now, read terms are going to not default to checked. Why? Because they want you to actually say, yes, I have read this in a legal sense, so that they can say, hey, if you registered for this account, you had to agree to the terms in case there is some issue that comes up in the future. Finally, this is a text area. And I can specify rows and columns. But instead, I'm going to specify in the CSS. So I'm going to say text area. Remember, if you have a choice of doing it in HTML or CSS, do it in CSS. So make the height 200 pixels. I'll make the width 600 pixels. Wow, we have a big comment area there. Make it a little smaller. All right, that's a little better. All right, our submit button is type equals submit. We saw that last time. I have two submit buttons here just to show you that you can have two submit buttons. What's the difference between the two? It will tell the script which button got clicked. So submit 1 is clicked, button submit 1 equals submit 1. If I click submit 2, button submit 2 equals submit 2. So I could tell which button was clicked in case you do something different. Well, if you have two buttons, you're probably going to do something different if one's clicked versus the other. For example, this could be an edit and save update, update the database, or this could, the first button could be update the database, the second button could be delete entry, right? That way, it's important for the script on the other end to know, gee, did they pick that they wanted to update or did they pick that they wanted to delete? So there very often can be two submit buttons in cases like that. All right, we're going to cover a couple other things with this as far as styling goes. First of all, we have what's called a field set. A field set goes around things that are logically grouped together. So for example, the first 4 items you could call personal data. They're data about the person. The rest of them are preferences. All right. In other words, do you prefer this or that? Do you prefer this or that? So I have a field set around the first 4 things. And I have a second field set around the last few things. Associated with a field set is a legend tag that will give you just a little explanation here. Personal info, preferences. This is especially useful if you have longer forms. Like, for example, any of you that, what would be a good example? The FAFSA form, right? To enter in for financial aid, there's like tons of information you have to give. And they may lie. I don't know, it's been a while since I entered in a FAFSA form, but there might be sections of the form that you want to designate that this might be, father's income, this might be mother's income, for example, you might have on a screen. So you can put field sets around them to show which is which. Another thing that's very important is for accessibility, we use this label tag. Now this label tag uses the ID, not the name. So that's another reason that we use an ID here, so we can use a label tag. What is this telling me? It's telling me that the label for the thing that has an ID of text name is name. Now, if someone is viewing the form and they have good eyesight and they can see the form, they can see that this is this. You know, this name is the label for this text box. But if you can't see that form item, if you're blind or have poor vision or whatever, you will often use a screen narrator that will read you the page. And if you don't use the label tag, the screen reader will get to this and not know what to call it. And therefore, the user on the other end that has poor vision or is blind doesn't know what this represents, therefore doesn't know what they're supposed to enter in here. The label ties together the form control with the description of the form control. So this for text email, email. For drop-down age range. Text password, text password. Now, it's pretty much, you know, there's pretty much a 1-to-1 ratio. The radio buttons are a little bit different because you don't have a label for the whole radio button group. You have a label for each individual radio button. So this says that this radio button belongs to rock. So even though all these three are in the same radio button group, they have their own labels associated with them so that the user understands which is which. Likewise with the rest of them. It's important to do that. If you don't use the label tag on your assignment, I'll take off points because we're taking accessibility very seriously in this class. All right, other things. What I've done in the CSS, I've actually only did a little bit in the CSS. I put a border around it. All right, sometimes it's good to set apart the form from the rest of the page. And I used a 2-pixel black dotted. I use the dotted just because, you know, just for variety's sake, you know, instead of making all the borders solid, we'll use a dotted one. The width is set to 50% of the page. But the minimum width is 400 pixels. It won't get any smaller than 400 pixels. Margin is 0 pixels auto. That centers the form within its container. That is within the page. I then have made every form control its own LI in an unordered list. That makes sense because what is a form? A form is a list of values that we're going to send to a server. So it's a list and it doesn't have a predefined order. We could put, for example, email before name and it doesn't change the meaning of anything. All right. So therefore, it's an unordered list. But it would be a little awkward if I saw bullet points next to each of these. So I get rid of the bullet points on that unordered list. Now, here I've made the width of each label 40%. Display inline block, because a label is normally an inline tag, and I want to take advantage of some of the block tag aspects of the label. So I use this sort of hybrid, so I can do a text line of right. So let me show you with a border what that means. All these labels start off here, but since I've said text align right, it puts the label pushed over to the right. Then I have the text, the text box and all the other form controls right along with it. So I get this neat little alignment. Without this, I get this where the things don't align nicely. Name and email coincidentally line up well, but age range sticks out, password sticks out, and these, it's kind of hard to see that they're grouped together because they're sort of jagged like this. It's actually not that horrible in this example, but in other examples, it could even be worse. So that's my recommended way of styling a form. I can also style any of the legend, for example. Make it blue. Get set to blue. Or I could change the default border for a field set. Not suggesting this is a good, pretty looking design. I'm just illustrating the capabilities that we have. Nice thing again about using this tool, Visual Studio Code, is as I type in, I can see what my options are. All right. These are the basic form tags. There's a whole set of other tags that are used for forms, though. There's that have been added since added as part of HTML5. And we can spot these here. We have an input for a color. And what's your favorite color? Or what color do you want your screen to be? And that gives this little color picker. You could choose that item. And that gets sent to the server that way. We have an input for date that is expecting a date in this format. And if we click on it, it shows me a calendar that I can pick a date in. A minimum maximum where we could say, give me everything, or give me the minimum date of being January 1st, 2000, and give me a maximum date of, or this has a maximum date of December 31st, 1979. This one has a minimum date of 2000, January 2nd. For email, if I type in something like this, that's not a valid email address, and I'll get an error. A valid email address is something like this. And that's valid. Through the use of these HTML5 form controls, we can do some validation right in the form. Otherwise, we have to use JavaScript. And please review these on your own to get a better understanding of them. All right, what I like to do is at least start the example on tables and show you what tables do. All right. Now, what tables are used for are to put things in columns. So in this case, I have a sample monthly budget. Month, January, and so on. Electric bill, gas bill, housing, and food. Notice how they line up in columns. Now, they're not very pretty yet, okay? But we haven't put any styling on this table yet, all right? So that's why this is true. It lines up in rows and columns, but it doesn't look particularly good. What we'll cover next time is we'll go over the form tags in more detail, and we'll review a good way to style that, or different ways that you can style it. But for now, let's just preview the form tags that we have. First of all, we have a table tag that starts at the top, and the end table tag is at the bottom. The next main table tag that we'll go over is the TR tag. For now, don't worry about the T head tag. We'll cover that next week. But we have a TR tag that relates to a table row. So everything in this part is going to be in one row on the table. So month, electric bill, gas, housing, and food are on one row. THs and TDs specify whether the data is a header or data. In other words, in this case, electric bill isn't a piece of data, it's the header for this column. So we put that in the TH tag. And these are pieces of data with the exception of January. So we put those in a TD tag for table data. So those are the fundamental three tags. Now we are going to expand upon this to go over other important tags, but table, T rows, TRs, table rows, and then within each table row we have THs or TDs to represent either table headings or table data. So review this example in more details, and we'll cover it more thoroughly in next week's class. All right, are there any questions? Okay, that's all I had for today. We will see you either in lab or we will see you next week.